A very good Saturday morning. So I want you to think about what products, what companies are absolutely indispensable to you. Like if you look at your day to day, what can you not live without? What's become part of your daily life? Well, I am delighted to have Jim Kerr with us this morning. And Jim is an executive coach, organizational development expert. In fact, he has a plethora of expertise that he'll tell us about. But what I want to start talking to him about is indispensable, which is build and lead a company that customers can't live without. So, Jim, let's start with that. And before we start with indispensable, how do you introduce yourself when people ask you what you do?
Sure. Nadia, it's great to be with you this morning, so thanks for the opportunity. I describe myself as a management consultant and executive coach that helps top leaders achieve their vision for the future, whatever that might be. So I do all kinds of transformation and change work on behalf of my clients to help them get where they want to go.
And become indispensable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of to the book's been 30 years in the making. I've been in this racket for, I hate to admit it, over 30 years now.
Since you were but a child.
Yeah, when I was four, I started. But no, so yeah, in reality, the book is really sort of a collection of lessons that I've learned over the years working with some of the greatest organizations on the planet. I started to see some themes emerge, and those became the pillars of the book. And I decided to write about that. And I've got tons of examples from industry, tons of examples from my own practice that sort of supports the premise, and that's really to offer the reader an agenda that will let them, you know, build and lead a company that customers can't live without.
So right now, when you said that, and when you and I chatted this morning, I immediately thought of what can't I live without? Well, certainly my Apple devices. And then I don't think there's a week goes by that an Amazon package doesn't arrive, including
Right.
one with your book, right? I mean, that's
Well, I
the
love
reality.
that, Nadia.
But you know, what can't we live without? Like some people can't live without their certain product or their certain type of shoe or their
Sure.
certain particular app. If we had to say to everybody who was joining us this morning, and please feel free to comment, type into the chat, we'll try and answer your questions. But there are iconic companies that have become indispensable. I mean, think about when you and I grew up. I'm not putting us in the same age group, but we might be somewhat. I mean, I grew up, there was no such thing as Amazon. There was certainly no such thing as the internet. In fact, in South Africa, we only got television when I was about 8 or 9 years old.
Mhm.
So when we think of the things that are indispensable to us now that we didn't even grow up with, think about your day to day life. So, how do you coach an organization to become that kind of company that is indispensable?
Yeah, well, you threw out two great examples, Apple and Amazon, to the fans of each of those companies. You know, customers can't live without those products and those services. The way you get there, I believe, and I think it's a six-step process, frankly, but it starts off with leadership. Starting out with a leadership mentality that's inclusive, that's transparent, where everybody's operating, together to help the organization achieve its vision is critical. I think the second step is vision. Can we articulate a vision in such a way that's compelling and engaging, so that every member of the organization feels they've got something at stake in helping the organization achieve that vision. The third piece is culture. Can we craft a culture? My definition of culture, anyway, is it's behavior. It's how we behave and interact with our each other within the organization and with our stakeholders, suppliers, sales forces, and the customer. The next piece is people, right? So, can we get the people aligned that fit into the culture, that buy into the vision, that lead in the way that we want our organization to be led? And then there's a whole trust thing that comes from that as well. So now I can establish an engagement capability where everybody trusts each other. And then the last piece is change. We've got to introduce a change framework that allows us to manage transformation in a consistent way so there's no surprises as we go forward. Because organizations are living entities, they're constantly changing, and we've got to make sure that the people that work within them understand how to make change happen. And those are
And
kind of the
Jim,
6 parts of the book.
and change, your pillar of change, is more critical, more important than ever because the amount of change that organizations have had to endure over the last year is unprecedented.
Yeah, for sure, Nadia. I mean, and you saw some companies pivot really well, and they got back, sort of on the horse, if you will, almost immediately as the country shut down, as the world shut down. They were able to transform their businesses using tools like, StreamYard and Zoom and all that.
Companies
And
like,
well, again, the ones that come to mind are some of the ones I'm working with. General Dynamics, for example, did a marvelous job with that. Amazon, a terrific job. They were focused on trying to really drive into the SpaceX world and pre-pandemic, and then all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and they doubled down on being able to be the supplier of everybody who wants to shop online. They expanded their market by being an incredible service delivery vehicle. So again, there's tons of examples of
can you tell us a
businesses
little
like
bit
that.
more about General Dynamics? Hoping
Sure.
that people who are joining us today, if you have just joined us, I'm talking to Jim Kerr, and Jim's book, Indispensable: Build and Lead a Company That Customers Can't Live Without, is talking about how you create a company that is truly indispensable. And it starts with culture, and he speaks about all the pillars. But we're talking about change and adaptability, which is so critical. So tell us about General Dynamics, perhaps a little lesser known to some people, what they did pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and how they're doing now.
Sure. General Dynamics is a major defense manufacturer. They build submarines and tanks and sort of everything in between. But the thing the that they did pre-pandemic was there was this sense that people needed to be in the office, touch and see each other, and that was how work should get done. When the pandemic hit and offices closed and so on, they were able to get the technology out there to people so that they could start to work remotely. So I think it's a terrific example of what many organizations had to do. Because I worked with them, I know they did it very well, and they didn't miss a beat. They were able to enable their remote workforce to be just as productive as they were pre-pandemic. And I would also add that it'll be very interesting as we start to open up uh, sort of the country and the world again, and there'll be an ability to bring people back to the office. I think what one of the outcomes of all this was many organizations proved they could be as productive remotely as not. So it makes one wonder just how much that requirement of being in the office is going to last going forward here.
But as you say, the companies that have managed to make their remote workforces as productive. So, what are we seeing now? I was thinking about there's some Zoom gloom or whatever platform you're using. So, how do we press refresh? Because the remote workforces that were doing okay in the beginning, do you sense some burnout, some sense of despair, uncertainty?
Yeah, great. Great question, Nadia. And sure, I think there is some burnout. I think people are working longer hours because what's the workday look like? It looks like you roll out of bed and get on your computer, and sometimes when you're in the midst of something, it's hard to shut it off at the end of the workday, quote unquote. So yeah, there's some burnout there. My guess is as we start to re-enter society again and be able to be out there among other people, that we'll likely land in some kind of a hybrid where
Mm.
there's people in the office for certain activities or certain events, and then they're working remotely otherwise. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, back, and again, as I mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time, but I was working with the Hartford Insurance Company um, many years ago, and we talked about the idea of claim handling in an insurance company, and we said that, well, that's done remotely because a claims handler would go out and look at and say and inspect a loss. So whether it was a car accident or some damage to your home from a storm or what have you, they'd be remote. And then they'd have to come back to their office and kind of add the details of the loss, right, and report the loss, if you will. But what we were putting together was a strategy that said, well, no, they don't. We don't need those remote locations. They could actually have a handheld device and they could type the stuff in and take the pictures on that device and submit the information to headquarters and start the whole claims process. And as a consequence, they were able to eliminate a lot of office space around the country because they didn't really need it.
But does that not open itself to fraud? So you're saying the person who is claiming uses their handheld device to go around and then send submits it?
Not the insured. That would be the person that would have suffered a loss. Now, what I'm saying is, at least where we landed with the Hartford was that the person working for the Hartford
Could
who
go.
right who inspects the claim would be going out there with a handheld
That makes
device and so
sense.
on. Yeah,
Okay, they would go and then submit their pictures.
right,
Right.
and details of the situation, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense. So it's interesting as we look at the concept of pivoting, a culture that was already planning, was already agile, and then those that weren't. And so you come in and look at it and say, how do we quickly adapt? And what do we have that we can adapt?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, it's situational. Every client will have their own sort of vision for where they want to bring the organization. My job as a consultant working with those leaders is to help them translate what they're looking to accomplish into implementable chunks, new initiatives, new projects or programs, help them design those projects and programs, and then cases, many times, actually drive those projects and programs on their behalf. So I help them sort of figure out how to get from point A to point B by applying the sort of the tools of the trade of consulting. Craft some meaningful uh, definitions for initiatives that will help them actually bridge the gap between where they are today and where they want to be tomorrow.
And something I've noticed you write and speak about a lot is authenticity and decency. Now, those are words that we hear often. What do they really mean? How does that translate to you as a leader, as an organization?
Yeah, Nadia, thanks for bringing that up. I've been writing quite a bit for CEO World lately, and I wrote a five-part series on decency, um, and it's gotten some pretty good responses, reactions from the business world. People are responding to that message. And what it was really about was I believe that through all of this, starting before the pandemic, frankly, but certainly amplified by what we've had to go through in the last year or so, we've, in some instances, leaders have kind of lost their way about treating people decently. And I felt that it was important as a thought leader to try to contribute some thinking around that, point it out, shine a bright light on it, and then make some suggestions that leaders could use in order to start to put decency back on the agenda.
Now, you and I were talking about authenticity, and there's somebody like Elon Musk who really exemplifies the authentic leader. Doesn't always, would you say, I mean, he has an interesting reputation.
Yeah, for sure. But authentic he is, right? I mean, what you see is what you get. You may not like everything he's doing or saying, but he's leading in a way that's genuine for him. And I talk about this in the book. In fact, the last chapter of the book, it's called "Keep It Real," And the reason that I wrote it was after going through those six parts of indispensability, which is really an agenda or a formula that one could follow. I'm reminding the reader that it's critically important to be genuine. If you're not, people can see that, and you're going to erode trust, which is one of the key pillars, right? So, if you don't come across genuine, if indeed you're not authentic, and people, and your people start to sniff that out, then they don't trust you. Then they don't start to trust each other, and that's when your culture gets corrupted, and your vision for the future becomes something that's really challenged because you don't have the people working together to help you get there. So again, keeping it real, being authentic, essential part of leadership.
And probably more so during this past year, what I see, Jim, is that there's such a desire. The fact that we are now seeing each other in each other's homes, so much of the facade has been stripped away.
Right.
And it's okay to say, by the way, today hasn't been my best day, or I'm struggling with this in a way that's become acceptable. For me, that's one of the, in a way, positive byproducts, if there is, of the whole COVID reality, is that in order to motivate our teams, in order to make them as productive and collaborative as possible, we have to identify what they're going through. And by us being authentic, vulnerable, it helps them.
Yeah, for sure, and being empathetic, right, which is kind of part of the decency quotient, if you will,
Yeah.
is a critical part of all that. It's true. I mean, you see people that jump on Zoom calls for a meeting, and they're in their sweats and their hair's not made up or what have you. And I think that is an indication that maybe when we get back to it again, that people will be a little bit more comfortable just sort of being who they are when they go to
Yeah,
work.
it's so interesting. By the way, we do have some comments. Thank you, Catherine Marshall. She says, can't wait to read this book. What a great concept. And Antonio says, me too, excited to read this. And really, what you've encapsulated, and we'll go through the pillars again if people are just joining us around how to be indispensable. And it's really a complex issue because it's not one thing, it's multifaceted.
Right.
But as far as the authenticity, Jim, yesterday I interviewed executive coach Melissa Davies, and she said instead of saying to people something like, "So, Jim, how are you doing? Jim, what's one thing I can do right now to support you?
Mm,
What are two things I can do right now to support you?"
hmm.
Just that sense of leadership, of real concern for others, and tuning in and accepting the imperfections is
Yeah.
something I think we've all had to do. Because what is our goal at the end of the day, and certainly your role as a consultant, is to bring out the best in each and every person so that they can collaborate, adapt. And
Yeah.
practically, how do we do it?
Right. I know Melissa, and yeah, I know that what she's talking about is something that she practices. Um, I think, and this comes up particularly in my leadership coaching, I tend to get organizations that will give me six, seven, eight, sometimes up to 10 people that they see as high potentials, and they want me to help develop them so that when C-level opportunities arise, these people are ready, excuse me, to take the leap and sort of join the C-suite. And yeah, to the point, one of the things I emphasize in the coaching work is that as a leader, your job is to enable your team to win.
That's
And
beautifully put.
yeah, and that's kind of what I think Melissa may be talking about too. How can I help you today? I mean, that's a wonderful question to ask your team every day. Um,
What specifically can I do, Jim, to
right.
support you? Just, and I know we've been speaking about this, but the ability to ask something specific and be sincere, not, hi, Jim, anything I can do to help you? You
Right,
know,
right. Yeah, there's a difference between the conversational tone and authentic, an authentic question and listening, right? You have to stick around long enough to hear the response.
yes. And that's a challenge for a lot of people for various reasons. First of all, on virtual platforms, listening is more, demands more concentration.
Sure. Yep.
I mean, do I wish I was sitting in a chair talking to you? I'd see your body language and see the nuances. And I'm always pausing that much longer. Does the person have something more to say?
Right.
An interesting piece you wrote recently, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot at all, Jim, was around, you said, you'd spoken to your wife and daughters, and we were talking about supporting women in the workplace. And as men, what can you do? And I just thought that was interesting coming from you, and love your thoughts around that and what people can do anyway to be more inclusive in how they hire and how they see others.
Sure. What I saw was it was a topic that was often talked about in some of the meetings that I participate in during the week. I've got one meeting that you and I actually are part of where we share those kinds of ideas. It's all among thought leaders. And we kind of wrestle with sort of the topic of the moment. And I saw a consistent theme emerge through those conversations around the differences related to equality in the workplace. And it made me think about it a bit. And I went back and I spoke with my wife and my daughter, who are working professional, women. And I kind of had a really interesting conversation with them. And I realized, I guess I could call myself a feminist, and maybe I should put myself out there and say that I am, because I think any group of people that feel like they're not treated fairly or equally or so on need allies. So I thought, well, okay, I can put a piece out there. I don't have any answers really, but I've got a lot of questions. And in fact, I end that piece with a few questions to the reader saying, hey, regardless of where you think you are on this topic, ask yourself these questions. And one of them, was as simple as, do you do you treat people differently based on gender? Kind of an interesting question, right? Another
Yeah.
one is, do you, believe that equality is something that everyone should have, and if not, then who shouldn't be equal and why?
Right. And I'm sure most people say, of course, of course, of course. But, again, do their actions, does the experience of them reinforce who they are? Isn't that
Right,
part of authenticity? Lots of
right,
people claim to be,
right.
but when you look at their track record, it's different and there's a disconnect.
Right, and it's really uncomfortable to sort of see that when it happens live, right? I've got some colleagues that talk about this subject. They've written books on it, and yet when they start to share stories about some of the things they're doing, you realize that they're really not living what they're talking about,
Mm.
and that's I don't know, it's a real turnoff for me anyway.
Now, there must be times that you are coaching or working with an organization where there's some difficult things you have to share with the person or people you're working with, where there is a disconnect between how they want to be perceived and the actions they're taking. How do you redirect behavior? It looks like Jim has frozen. Now, that could be on my side or his side. Jim, I'm going to ask you, if you can hear me, to please dial in again. I'm Nadia Belchik, and I'm delighted to be talking to Jim Kerr this morning. And we've been talking about just the concept of being indispensable. And I'm going to see if I can get him back in here. Okay. If he comes back in, he comes back in. By the way, a lot of what I talk about is just your ability to handle things going wrong. So there I was having a fabulous conversation to the author of Indispensable, Build and Lead a Company Customers Can't Live Without, Jim Kerr. And then somehow he disappeared off my stream. I'm going to hope that he'll come back. While I wait for him to come back, I'm going to play you a video about the concept of owning your space. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this.
So what does it mean to own your space? So Own Your Space, which is my book, keynotes, workshops, is all around giving yourself permission to be the person presenting information. If you are giving a sales presentation or you are being interviewed for a new position, do you own your space? Do you look comfortable? Do you look confident? Do you come across both confidently and competently? And in owning your space, you need to understand the verbal and non-verbal elements of your physical space. In other words, what you say, but equally important is how you say it. And then we look at your virtual owning your space. Is your LinkedIn profile complete? Do you have a good picture of yourself? Think about owning your podium when you give a presentation. Do you look comfortable? Do you look commanding? So these are just some of the topics that I cover in Own Your Space. And I ask you to really think about, do you maximize the overall way you project yourself in every interaction? Because if you do, you are truly owning your space.
Hello, and I'm delighted to have Jim back. So what you just saw there, for those of you who have just joined us or been with us for a while, is what happens when there's a technical glitch and you're live. So if that happens during a presentation, do what I did, just be very calm, be authentic and totally transparent, explain to your audience. And then, Jim, by the way, I did have a video on standby in case things go wrong, which they inevitably do. So glad to have you back. Jim is talking to us about being indispensable, and I think the concept is genius. Jim, in terms of the pillars, let's go through them again, and then we'll tell people how they can reach you. I will also put it into the comments so people can reach you directly, and also if they want to buy the book, how they do that. But let's start off with just a recap of the pillars of building and leading a company that customers can't live without, especially during times of rapid change.
Sure. So there's six pillars in the book. The first one's leadership, and it's about really making sure you've got a consistent sort of leadership philosophy that you've established, and you're developing leaders to sort of live by that philosophy. The second one is vision, which is really about describing the future that you want to create for your business and for your people. Make sure it's compelling and engaging. Make sure it's vivid. People can see themselves being successful within that. The third part is culture. How do we build an environment where people operate and behave in ways that are consistent with achieving the vision? The fourth piece is people. You want to make sure that the people are aligned with it and feel comfortable living within the culture you're establishing. The next piece is trust, and it's really about helping people work in ways where they can count on one another, where they feel like they're in it together, and so forth. And then the last part is the change framework. Make sure that you establish ways of doing change in a very consistent fashion so that people can handle it. Because, as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation this morning, organizations are living entities. They're in a constant state of change, and we've got to make sure that people feel comfortable making changes happen.
And, we keep talking about this, you, Jim, me, about how as human beings, we don't like change because we really perceive it to be dangerous and we're on alert for danger. And if we don't help our people understand that change can be positive and we are just going with the gut reaction of change is danger, I feel insecure, then people cannot do their best. So it's so critical that we address this. I always remind people how hard we find change. Just try brushing your teeth with the other hand.
Right.
Oh, exactly. It was so interesting because last night we were driving to friends and Waze was telling us to go a different way to the way we always go. And it was so interesting watching my husband navigate because he wanted to go the way he's always gone. And I kept saying to him, do the ways. They're obviously telling you to go for a reason, which of course they were. But just watching that resistance to doing something different is so powerful.
Yeah, it sure is, and that's why I think change frameworks have to be things that companies focus on deliberately. Uh, I've seen over the years working with various clients that when they start to drive a transformation effort of some sort, it's almost like they're starting from scratch. They don't have methodologies and techniques and practices that they've institutionalized. So as a consequence, they reinvent the wheel every time they have to drive a change initiative.
If anything, this period has shown us is how agile you have to be and creating
Right,
a culture of agility.
right, for sure.
There's no question. So I know what I was busy asking you when you dropped off is that part of your role is to have to redirect behavior. And sometimes people lack the awareness. So you're saying to them, be authentic, or, you have to listen more, or some of the feedback you give to the disconnect between how they want to be perceived and how they are. Just how do you do that in a way that people receive it without feeling defensive?
Well, giving people feedback can be really challenging, particularly if they're not interested in hearing it, right? So I try to do a couple of different things, and it's part of what I coach up with the people that I work with. Be the living example first and foremost. Be that person that tells it like it is. If that's something that you need to give feedback to someone else on, you've got to make sure that your house is in order too, right? So so be the living example is the first part. The second part is you can ask like, hey, are you interested in some feedback? And if the answer is yes, then try to provide it, delicately, of course, and talk about how they might be able to improve things going forward. So it becomes a way for them to perhaps fold into their repertoire, if you will, as they take in what you're offering as advice or feedback, and then show them ways to use it and to adapt it into what they're doing. Um, I sometimes feedback is great and sometimes it's not great. It all kind of depends on the interaction between the players, right?
Right.
Sometimes you want to hear it and sometimes you don't. And you know, I always feel like we have an obligation as leaders to provide that feedback. I see a lot of leaders fail their teams by not addressing poor performance on
Mm.
the parts of some of the players. So, if you really want to be a full-fledged leader, you've got to be able to handle, the good with the bad. And maybe part of the challenge for you as a leader is to be more comfortable providing feedback.
And Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. Really, just so much great advice, guidance, and insight at a time where nobody can rest on any laurels, right? This is a time that everybody's got to be top of their game. We're dealing with humans first and foremost. And are we really just tuning into their needs? And the needs that people have now are different to what they were experiencing even a year ago.
Right? Yeah, for
So
sure.
really appreciate it. Indispensable is available on Amazon and
Right,
elsewhere. And if
right.
people want to reach you, Jim, what is the best way? And I'm actually going to type it into the LinkedIn. LinkedIn, Jim has his whole profile there, link in with him, but what and is the best way to reach you?
Sure. I think the best way is to go to the website, and that's indispensable-consulting.com. And there's various ways to connect via email or a phone call.
Indispensable, and it's a dash,
Right. Yeah.
like not a forward slash, a dash,
Correct.
consulting.com.
Yep. Yep.
Indispensable. I hope I have spelt it correctly. If I haven't, I know you will. Indispensableconsulting.com. Thank you. It's everybody can spell perfectly unless they're having to do it under pressure. So thank you. Jim, just my last words to people as we navigate the so-called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world is when you hear from a Jim Kerr who I always say the pleasure of having you, Jim, is I know your hourly fee, and the fact that you've spent nearly half of it with us this morning is incredibly valuable. And that's what I do love about the social media platform sharing is we have people like you who are very generously sharing advice and guidance and just ways, and really just start with taking the time to look at what needs to change and then doing it, right? Last words of advice for anyone who's joining us this morning who may be struggling with the gap between where they want to be and where they are. Where do we start?
Yeah, I think you have to start by really asking yourself, doing that soul searching. What is it that I really want? What am I trying to achieve? And I think if you really get a good, vivid understanding of what that is, what that vision is for yourself, then you'll start to take steps towards it, and you'll be amazed by the kinds of guides and support you'll receive as you start down that path towards what you want to achieve. So, my last bit of advice is hang in there, be kind to other people, be kind to yourself, and do what you have to do to be able to live your dreams.
Beautiful. Jim Kerr, thank you so much.